Hey, this is Yazuki Wolf, and welcome to another episode of Japan Quest. Today, we're going to be talking about the three phases of living in Japan. And so basically, I got the idea for this video on something I learned in a marriage class, actually. When I was in college, I was curious about the psychology of marriage. So I took a course on it, and they actually taught us something called the three phases of love, I believe it was, or three phases of marriage. It might have been marriage. I'm not sure. Probably was love. But so it's the infatuation phase, the disinfatuation phase, and the maturity phase. So when you're in a relationship with someone, generally, at the very beginning of the relationship, you enter what's called the infatuation, where you see that person in the most positive light possible. You see them, well, you're not really seeing them, you're seeing your ideal image of them. So you kind of just see the good parts, and then you fill in all the blanks with your imagination. Like, oh, this is the best person ever. Completely in love with them. Like, they're perfect, and I feel so alive whenever I'm with them or whatever. And that's the infatuation phase. It's all just what you call it, like roses and flowers everywhere, right? And when you first come to Japan, that's kind of the phase that you're in when you first start to live here. It's the infatuation of I'm in Japan, and you like want to just run out into the middle of the street and just yell like I'm in Japan or whatever, kita, whatever, and that's the infatuation, and if everything feels great, you don't see any of the negatives, you only see the positives, and you're just running around seeing like always surprised by what's around the next corner, and everything is just perfect. And I think if I look back at myself, I think there was a long time where I used to like a lot of things just because they were Japanese. You know, like it maybe, and it actually was kind of helpful in some cases where like maybe there's some food that I wouldn't have given a chance otherwise, but since it was Japanese food, like I felt like I had like a duty to try to like this thing. So I would test it, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, I like it, even though maybe I was still kind of questionable about it. But you know, it's Japanese. I have to like these things, and so I was only looking at the positives, right? And that phase probably lasts somewhere between a year to 2 years, actually, when you live here, and that may explain why a lot of times when you see people who live here, they usually either love it or hate it within the first year or two, and so most people that do go back home, it does seem to happen within that time period, because the next thing that happens after infatuation in a relationship is disinfatuation. And disinfatuation is when you start to see the negatives, that kind of illusory image that you had, like blocking all the negatives, starts to fade away. And for the first time, you see the other person for who they are and not just who you thought they were. And this is actually in relationships where a lot of people start to run into issues with cheating or just breaking up or other kind of like struggles, because this is where you find people say things like, I fell out of love. You know, like he's just not the person I thought he was, or she's just not the person I thought she was. And that's because they're not. You in the infatuation period, you were looking at an idealized image of the person, and a lot of people run into the trap where they'll always look for that infatuation period, and they associate that with love, and so whenever that fades away, they move and look for the next person, and then they start over again another year or 2 years. Then the infatuation fades away. It's like once again, oh, I fell out of love, and then go to the next person, and it's a continuous spiral cycle. But in the disinfatuation period, it can be tough. So when you're in Japan is very similar to a relationship. You're in this country, and you loved everything about it, but then now, you know, you're looking for an apartment, and people are actually telling you, no, we don't rent to foreigners, or we don't rent to non-Japanese, and you're like, well, that's weird. And then you're like, it's so annoying, because like I try to have like a conversations with people, and I use like the humor that I'm used to in my country, and people just don't understand it, or I watch the TV here and I don't understand their humor, or it's like and when you get together with some foreign friends and people are just complaining about Japan, they're like, oh, don't you hate how Japan does this and that, and then and all these negatives start popping up, and a lot of times that might be too much for some people, and they'll leave the country, and they'll be like, oh, Japan wasn't what I thought it was, or you know, whatever. But once again, I think that's just like relationships, where any place you go to, the longer you're there, you're going to start seeing that. And so a lot of times now I notice that when I'm with my foreign friends and we're kind of bashing on Japan, I'm like, sometimes I'll stop and be like, yeah, you know, it is kind of a, what do we call it? It is a stress relief to kind of like let go of these feelings, but you know that if we weren't in Japan and we were in our home countries, we would be saying the same crap about the other countries too, right? Because no country's perfect, and the longer you're there, you start seeing things that you don't like. And when we first came to Japan, we used to say how better it was to our home countries, right? So there is two sides to the coin, and so that's where we get to the third phase of love, marriage, and life in Japan. Three very similar topics. So the third phase is maturity. And that's what you get to when you go through the disinfatuation period. You see the person for who they are, and you decide to love them for who they are and not for the image that you had in your head. And that's the maturity phase, because in a marriage where after 2-3 years and you start to lose sight of who the original image of the person was, and you see them for who they are, flaws and cracks and ugly sides and everything combined together, and you say, you know what? I see all the good, all the bad, and I still love you. And I love you maybe even more now because I realize that you are a real person and not just some fantasy image in my head. And that's the same thing with Japan. If you're here long term, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people that do decide to go back. Maybe it just wasn't the thing for them. And just like in relationships too, if you break out of a relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's through any fault of your own. But I'm saying that the mature relationships are the relationships that can see the other person or the other country as it is and still recognize that they love it. And I say that I've reached that phase. I've lived here 13 years or so. I lose track. It's been so long that it's hard to count anymore. But I definitely feel like I love Japan, and I realize more and more as days go by. Like I don't run through the streets yelling like, I'm in Japan, I love this place, or anything like that. And then sometimes my friends from the States will be like, why are you in your house? Why don't you go out and explore? And you're in Japan, man, you should do more. And like, yeah, there was a phase where I did that, but now I feel very comfortable living here. And it's just in that quiet comfort that every once in a while you just kind of sit back and you're like, you know what? I really like it here, There's just so many things that just fit perfectly for me. And I see the negatives there, and sometimes with my other foreigner friends, I'll talk about them. But for me, like those don't outweigh the positives, and I really do love this country. It seems to be a really good fit for me and my lifestyle and sort of my character traits. But it may not be for everyone. But at any rate, those are the 3 phases to love, marriage, and life in Japan. Till next time, yoroshiku.